Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the new CrinEar project Meta. I am joined by Listener to talk about this new IEM from Crinacle. So without further ado, let's get going with the review. First things first, the CrinEar project Meta comes in this very simple, no-nonsense box. I greatly appreciate the minimalism with which this box is presented to you. Importantly, no cartoon child, which is always nice to see. Maybe some people feel differently, but I'm a big fan of the no cartoon child aesthetic.
As am I.
These days. Yeah. You also get this ridiculously huge case. When I first opened the box, I was like, okay, damn, this is this is a chunky case. But yeah, how do you feel about the case?
Yeah, I like the case. I mean, it's the same one that came with the Mega 5 EST, but without the kind of custom foam insert that limited the amount of stuff you could put in it. So it's quite a bit roomier, but it's very like robust feeling. Obviously, you can't fit it in a pocket, but when I'm taking IEMs around, I usually put them in like my sling bag, and this is perfect for that. So I actually quite like it.
Sling bag approved. Yeah, I prefer a smaller case.
Very reasonable.
You also get a bunch of tips that come with it. You get small, medium, and large, and then you get foam tips, which you hate, of course.
I do. As far as what's included in the box here, tip-wise, you get kind of one set of multiple sizes of silicone, and then what seems like a few sizes of foam too. I just personally wish there was another type of silicone tip, whether it was like something a little bit shorter or with a little bit of a different bore size, just to give the user a little bit more sonic flexibility or fit flexibility depending on what the construction of the tip looked like.
We'll talk about the tips a little bit in the sound section, but like I do think this is fine. I think additional tips could be included, and I just want to note that like the small tips, you can get a deeper insert and that will affect the sound, so it is worth playing around with that. But as far as, you know, the rest of the accessories here, it's fine. I actually do like the cable quite a bit. The cable, you get a modular termination, so you can choose Pentagon or you can choose 3.5 millimeter, and the cable doesn't feel stiff or anything like that. It's nice, reasonably ergonomic and not microphonic. I had no problems using the cable. The shell itself, I think it actually looks nice, sleek and classy. The colorway isn't exactly for me, but I can see people liking it. But importantly, I like that the faceplate is kept simple and clean. But I'm not a huge fan of, you know, it's saying CrinEar and Meta on there. I think, you know, those types of things should be left to the other things that are branded, like the case and whatnot. But what do you think about the shell design?
Yeah, I agree for the most part. The shell design itself is quite nice, but I do wish, both for this IEM and just for all IEMs in general, that there was just like no text on the faceplate and they just let the kind of design of the shell speak for itself, especially with this one because it's got such a nice like beveled edge with the copper contrasting the black, and it all coheres with the cable. It looks quite nice, but I think I would just rather without the gamery kind of text that's on it.
The ergonomics for the shell are good. I think better than what you get on like the Dusk default DSP.
Definitely.
I call it that, but like, you know what I mean? The Dusk. So not as ridiculous of a nozzle. Overall, it fits quite well. My one sort of complaint is that with these more contoured ergonomic shells, they're not going to be as accommodating of, you know, the widest range of people. Like, for example, for me, this little back piece does press into a ridge in a part of my ear that I don't enjoy. But I think overall, it's a really solid shell. I don't have too many complaints here. I think most people will enjoy it. How's it fit for you?
Yeah, for the most part, I agree. It's a small shell with decent molding. The size, angle of the nozzle all work well for me. I will say there's one issue I have, and it's not necessarily a shell thing, but might be a shell plus tip thing. With the stock tips, I find that the kind of front angle, like the front facing triangular angle, kind of juts into like the nubbin that covers my ear canal at the front, just a little bit, but I found with different tips, like a shorter tip in particular, it kind of like nudges that backward a little bit and it sits a little bit more comfortably. I think most people are probably going to find it pretty comfortable. As said, it's small and reasonably well contoured.
All right, should we talk about the sound?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, before we talk about the sound though, I just want to give a big plug to headphones.com, who makes all these videos possible. Headphones.com is a great place to learn about and buy headphones. It's where we publish all of our written articles and reviews. There'll be one from Listener up on headphones.com about the Meta here as well, if you're interested in checking that out. But importantly, they're the guys who make it possible for us to do what we do here and provide this information to you. So if you want to support what we do here, remember, consider headphones.com for your next audio purchase. We greatly appreciate it. Now, on to the sound quality of the Meta.
Yeah, you wanna go ahead and give your take first, and then I'll see where we disagree.
Yeah, so my take on the Meta is that I think a lot of people are gonna like this. I also quite like this. This is my second favorite of Crinacle's IEMs, Crinacle's products. My favorite being still the Dusk Default DSP, even though this is more ergonomic and I can see using this more regularly than that one. But as far as the sound quality is concerned, it's very similar to the Dusk Default DSP with a couple of very subtle differences. But overall, I think he's gone for a generally sensible tuning as far as what people think they want, but I would still kind of prefer some of the colorations here to be less. So in particular, I think that the bass profile isn't exactly the kind of profile that I like, even though it does sound a little bit maybe cleaner and clearer than others that have gone for this kind of tuning. More importantly for me, the biggest issue with the sound, and again, this is me nitpicking here because I think that the mid-range and treble are generally handled much better on this than on the vast majority of IEMs. I do get that sort of lower treble, lower to mid treble length mode issue. For me, it's right at around 6.3 kilohertz. When you use these smaller tips, you can actually get a deeper insert, but what happens for me at least, I lose the bass when I do this. So the length mode issue, the resonance at 6.3 kilohertz goes away, but then I don't get the bass out of it. So, for me, the better result is with these medium tips that I'm using here right now. And I just sort of deal with that slight forwardness there at around 6.3 kilohertz. But apart from that, I don't have too much to complain about. I think this is just a really overall solid IEM. It's just not quite what I want from a, let's say, JM1 baseline tuning.
Fair enough. I mean, I agree with a lot of that, I think. I think if I'm going to start with the good things, in terms of mid-range tunings, this is probably at least on par with the other very good ones, like the Mega 5 EST and the KE4 and the DaVinci and the Dusk DSP. I actually think the mid-range here is probably better than most of them in isolation. But the problem with that is we don't listen to the mid-range in isolation. We listen to them with the bass and the treble. And for me, the bass and treble are both way, way too forward for this style of mid-range tuning, despite Crin's efforts to kind of curtail that behavior by moving the low shelf lower in frequency to, occlude the mid-range less. Unfortunately, it still just has a ton of bass. So you do kind of get, or at least I kind of get, that soft, kind of slow, overly rumbly, incoherent quality that a lot of the other new meta sets have. And similarly to those sets as well, it has a bunch of upper treble that I don't think is actually warranted here, except to balance the rather large bass shelf.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think people will like the bass. People who like bass will find something to like here. It's just that the bass quality itself is not that sort of like, hard-hitting, tight, tactile kind of bass. And I think people need to recognize kind of what they're getting into here. So if you're looking for that sort of like really hard-hitting wallop of a bass profile, this isn't that. This is more of I was going to say sort of like a whooshing bass, but it's even that's not quite right.
Yeah.
What I find is when I'm listening to music, it's almost like everything else is sort of coherent, and then every once in a while there's just this excess kind of like thumpiness on top at times, which does serve to kind of still mask some of the rest of sort of that lower mid-range presence. Not everybody's going to hear it that way, but that's kind of how it is for me on many of the recordings that I listen to. And as a result, I also find it to be maybe not quite as versatile of a bass profile as what you get with, say, the Softier's Volume S. But with that said, the trade-off there is that the mid-range on this is so much better, like so much better to my ear than the Volume S. So, I would still take the Meta over the Volume S, no questions asked, even if I prefer the way that the bass gets handled for that sort of like sense of like solid bass dynamism and impact on the Volume S. Given that, Crinacle and many folks who follow his stuff, they enjoy evaluations that include, sort of the technicalities, descriptions. What's your sense of that with this one and how it maybe ranks relative to some of the other ones that go for this style of tuning?
I'm going to start with dynamics because it's one of the more important qualities to me personally. Unfortunately, I don't really perceive it as any more dynamic than the other sets that are tuned like this. It's maybe a little bit less pillowy and like muffled than the DaVinci due to how much lower in frequency the bass shelf is, but I still get that sense of it being just kind of soft and, the bass decaying too long relative to the rest of the transient. So instead of getting this kind of snappy, precise attack feeling, you get kind of what just sounds a bit indistinct. Compared to things like the DaVinci and maybe the Mega 5, it's a little bit more precise, but I actually found relative to my KE4 unit that they were about on par, if a little bit favoring the KE4 in terms of that kind of note weight and kind of the mass behind movements. Kind of moving away from the more new meta sets, the Volume S is way more dynamic than this, like by an order of magnitude. Especially my set, which has a little bit less bass than your set did, is like,
but even mine was like crazy impactful.
Yeah, it's like way punchier and more textured and just of a higher quality bass presentation than this is. But, you know, you do have to, as you said, kind of deal with a different, a little bit shoutier mid-range to get that. In terms of, you know, like detail and stuff like that, I personally feel like the excess bass and treble kind of serve a little bit too much of a masking factor and just kind of occlude a lot of the texture that I want in the mid-range on things like piano and electric guitar. Now, for people who, for them, detail means a lot of texture on smaller cues, like little snare brushes or like breaths of a vocalist, I think they'll find that stuff is all there. But for me, detail tends to apply more to mid-range focused elements, and there's just not enough of that here for me. In terms of the stage, imaging, spaciousness, whatever you want to call it, I think this, like the other meta sets, tends to do pretty good. But I think, again, that's largely because the excess bass and treble kind of like brings some things closer to you, like the fundamentals of kick drums and bass guitars, while setting other things like vocals and piano, like as far as how they're perceived, further away. So while I think some people looking for a set for that might actually find a good pairing with the meta, it's not the kind of presentation I usually would go for.
So for me, I actually find this to be on the more detailed side compared to some of those other, or many of those other ones. Again, largely because of that you know, shifting the frequency where the bass rises a little bit lower. That does, you know, give it a bit more clarity overall. For the mids to come through, not as much as I think I would prefer, or not as much as I think is ideal, but it's still better than, for me at least, you know, than the KE4 that I heard or the Da Vinci. And I actually find this to be more detailed sounding than the Megafest. But that has more to do with the way that the treble is handled on the Megafest compared to this one here. For me at least, it just seems to propagate treble more than the Megafest, where the Megafest sort of kind of rolls off in a couple spots for me, even though it doesn't graph that way, it just does for me at my eardrum. This one doesn't. So I actually think for me, this, it gives that sense of, you know, the finer little nuances in the music a little bit better there. Still not quite on the level of the Dusk Default DSP. And so for that reason, this is still, yeah, it's still my second favorite out of all of these ones. And for the rest of it, yeah, I generally agree with what you said there about the subjective qualities. As far as the way that I would rank this, or where I would kind of place it overall compared to, you know, not just Crin's products, I still think this is my second favorite of this style tuning.
Below Dusk DSP.
That's right. Maybe you and I disagree on this, but like I quite like this product. I like it better than when I heard it at New York, actually. And I find that for the most part, this is a really solid interpretation of this kind of sound profile, even though I would argue, and maybe you agree with me here, that this is not the best way to handle this kind of sound profile, meaning the mid-range for this is not best served by the kinds of colorations that we get here in the bass. And you might say the treble as well, but we have very, very different preferences for treble. Yeah. But yeah, I would rank this, yeah, but right behind the Dusk Default DSP. What I like about it, of course, is that you get a kind of similar sound signature to that one without the need for the DSP cable. So you can just do this, you know, all analog with 3.5 millimeter. And so, you know, I would put this ahead of products like the Dunu Da Vinci and the KE4 and all the other ones that are there. Maybe I would say the closest would be the Megafest for me, but I can't really think of any other products that go for this kind of sound signature where we might say like, you know, meta-ish that, you know, would sort of beat this and the Dusk Default DSP. How do you rank them?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's very clearly better than the Da Vinci, at least, because like even just including everything, not just sound quality, it is way more ergonomic. The cable is nicer for me. It's better looking. It also does just kind of like sound better for most of the frequency response. I think still prefer the treble of the Da Vinci, but I think the rest of it is just a little bit too soupy. When it comes to the Mega 5 EST and the KE4, it's a little bit tougher for me. So what this definitely has over the KE4, because I would consider the ergonomics kind of on par, is the fact that it looks a lot better and the cable looks and feels a little bit better, but also the fact that it's a little bit more versatile with respect to tips. So the KE4 came with those flex tips that you kind of needed to use, or else the treble would just skyrocket. Whereas with this one, I found that rolling aftermarket tips did actually help the sound a little bit for me. Specifically going for a similar bore size as the stock tip, but with a little bit shorter of a core, helped me get a little bit of that deeper insert that you were talking about, and did make it sound a little bit more coherent to me. But I think in terms of the sound quality, it's right around where KE4 was for me, honestly. And also maybe right around where Mega 5 EST is. I think I like this maybe a little bit more than Mega 5 EST in the mids, but I actually find the bass and treble a little bit less coherent with the mids. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of hard to make that judgment just on a like which is better basis. I think people who want something like exciting and bass focused are probably going to like this more than Mega 5 EST. But me personally, I don't really have a discrete preference between those two. I just want to say, like, moving away from all of the meta sets for a second, I would take Soft Ears Volume S over this like any day of the week. Like, I feel like even though the mid-range is not...
That's where we disagree.
yeah, no. Like, and I think, you know, you're less tolerant of a little bit of forwardness in the upper mid-range than I am, which totally fair, because that one does have a little bit of glare there.
Yeah.
But I just feel like, for one, the subjective performance is just like way more compelling to me. It's more full, dynamic, weighty. It's also a bit more textured on the things I care about. But also just in terms of its tonality, even if the mids aren't as nice, it's much more coherent of a listen. And instead of being like a V shape, it's more of just a coherent downward slope, which sounds really nice to me. And it doesn't have any of the bass or treble issues that I have with, frankly, most of the meta sets, including the meta from Crin.
I mean, and this is where I think it's kind of, there's a bit of nuance there that's required for understanding this concept, which is that the idea of an anatomical baseline, you know, anatomical neutral baseline, has sort of been co-opted into these products that have excess bass and excess treble colorations. And where I think you and I agree is that, you know, that's not the best way to handle this kind of sound profile generally.
Yeah.
That, you know, like the you know, we call this JM1, which is, you know, we don't need to get into that here, but basically for this style of anatomical baseline, it's almost like it's trying to artificially create contrast where none need exist. And that contrast then overshadows all the rest of the good things about it. I think this is a trend for all of these sorts of IEMs. So the next thing for this style, you know, maybe it's the new meta.
Jesus,
I think
please
should
no.
be yeah, I think it should be doing exactly the kind of mid-range that you get here, mid-range and upper mid-range, just with less excess bass, or having a bass profile that's more gradual, right? That's what I look for. Kind of more similar to the Volume S's bass profile,
yeah,
but also less of the, you know, excess upper treble as well. And I know that folks are worried about that sort of like muddier kind of character to the low mids, but I still think there's ways of kind of like finding a middle ground there, or finding a way to basically have still satisfying, punchy, dynamic, impactful bass without causing that kind of like muddier mid-range.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the mid-range of the meta is fantastic. If it just had less bass, it would have more of the contrast feeling people have. Like, I don't know if you've gotten a chance to EQ it at all, but yeah, just dipping the bass on it a little bit like brings all of that back. So it's just kind of a shame that, you know, all of these sets are tuned fairly well. It's just none of them, including the meta, have really reached the full potential or the kind of end point of this approach to tuning that I think you and I are both waiting for.
Yep. And that is probably where we should end the review, that basically this is good. It's better than the older paradigms of tunings. It's moving in the right direction, but there's still more work to do, and we look forward to the next one. Yeah, so that's going to do it for this review. Once again, as always, if you guys are interested in the measurements for the Meta and many other products, we're going to have those up on the forum. That'll be linked below. We will also have a written review from Listener up on headphones.com, so make sure you guys check that out if you want additional information on the CrinEar Meta. And as always, if you want to chat with me, Listener, or other like-minded audio enthusiasts, check out our Discord, also linked below. And until next time, we'll see you guys later.
Bye!